Ink scratched against paper, a dry, rasping sound that filled the narrow hall while Penhaligon shifted his weight on the flagstones, feeling the damp find the seam of his left shoe and creep through the leather to soak the wool of his sock with a chill that settled deep. Mrs. Vance did not look up. Her hand trembled just slightly, a vibration that traveled from her wrist to the nib of the pen, causing the ink to splatter in microscopic dots across the page where the visitor's name should have been. She pressed harder until the nib dug a furrow into the cheap pulp of the logbook. "It's the damp," she said, without lifting her eyes from the table. "Gets into everything. The ink, the coal, the bones." Penhaligon said nothing. He kept his hands inside the pockets of his navy suit, fingers tracing the edge of his ration book through the lining. The fabric of his cuffs had been turned twice, the wool frayed to a soft grey fuzz that matched the color of the smog clinging persistently to the brickwork outside. He could smell the house around him, a thick stew of boiled cabbage, wet dog, and the sour tang of coal dust that no amount of scrubbing could lift from the woodwork. It was a smell that belonged to 1949, distinct from the cordite and rot of the years before, yet heavy with its own kind of suffocation. Penhaligon looked at the logbook. The leather cover was cracked, the pages swollen from the humidity. He thought about the files in his office, the thick folders stamped with red classifications that no one read, the reports that went into the bin because the truth was too complicated for the piece they were trying to build. He wanted to tell her that justice wasn't a transaction, that some debts couldn't be settled with cash and silence, but the words stuck in his throat, heavy and useless. "I'm not here to turn him out," he said quietly, then stopped blocking the draft. She turned back to the table, picking up a cloth to wipe the ink stain from the wood. "You're letting the cold in." He stepped aside, moving back against the wall where the plaster was cool and gritty under his shoulder blade. The house creaked. Somewhere above, a floorboard groaned under the weight of a shifting body. Penhaligon's head lifted. His hand stopped tracing the ration book. The sound was distinct, a deliberate pacing that moved from the back of the house towards the stairs, the rhythm of a man who knew he was being watched and had decided not to care. Mrs. Vance froze, the cloth hovering over the stain. She knew that step too. "He's coming down," she whispered. Penhaligon straightened his tie, the silk rough against his fingers. He didn't reach for his badge. There was no need. The air in the hallway thickened, the smell of cabbage suddenly cut by the scent of expensive tobacco, something foreign and rich that hadn't been sold in a London shop for 4 years. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and paused there, hanging in the dust motes. The scent hung there, suspended in the dust motes dancing above the stairs. Not Player's navy cut, not the shredded leaves and cardboard that passed for tobacco in the corner shop on the Kennington Road. This was heavier, Turkish, perhaps, or a Virginian blend that had slipped through the blockade when the channels were still open to men with the right papers. Penhaligon's nostrils flared, drawing the smoke in until it coated the back of his throat, sweet and cloying against the lingering odor of boiled cabbage. He appeared. Douglas Burnville Clay stepped onto the landing, one hand gripping the banister, the other holding a cigarette holder of dark amber bakelite. The light from the single bulb overhead caught the lapel of his jacket, revealing a sheen that belonged to a different decade, a different world. It was a grey suit, yes, but cut with a precision that made Penhaligon's own navy wool feel like burlap against his skin. The shoulders sat perfectly, without the padding of utility regulation, tapering into a waist that had not known hunger. Penhaligon shifted his weight, the sole of his left shoe squeaking faintly on the linoleum, a small betrayal of his presence that he immediately regretted. Clay did not look down. He began the descent, his shoes clicking on the bare boards, a rhythmic punctuation to the silence that had settled over the hallway. Mrs. Vance had stopped wiping the table. Her hands were clasped in front of her apron, the damp cloth dangling from one finger like a white flag of surrender. She watched the man's feet, counting the steps perhaps, or simply unable to lift her gaze higher than the polished leather of his brogues. There was a tension in her neck, the tendons standing out like cables under the thin skin, a physical manifestation of the calculation running behind her eyes. Rent paid, coal delivered, silence kept. Penhaligon pressed himself flatter against the wall, the gritty plaster digging into his shoulder blade through the thin fabric of his jacket. He wanted to speak. Protocol demanded an acknowledgement, a standard greeting that would establish the boundary between the observer and the observed, but the words died before they reached his tongue. To speak was to invite a response, and he was not certain he could bear the sound of Clay's voice, casual and unburdened, in this house of whispers. So he held his breath, letting the air stagnate in his lungs until the pressure built behind his ribs. "Good morning, Mr. Clay," Mrs. Vance said. Her voice was a thread, barely audible over the creak of the floorboards. Clay paused on the fourth step from the bottom. He turned his head, just enough to expose the profile of a jaw that was clean-shaven and soft, untouched by the razor burns of a morning rush or the stubble of a man who shaved with cold water and a blunt blade. He looked at Mrs. Vance, then his eyes slid past her to the window where the rain streaked the glass, and finally, inevitably, they landed on Penhaligon. There was no surprise in them, no flicker of guilt or fear. Only a mild, bureaucratic acknowledgement, the kind one clerk gives another when passing in a corridor. "Detective," Clay said. The word hung in the air, stripped of rank, stripped of authority, reduced to a mere label. He did not stop walking. He reached the bottom of the stairs and turned towards the front door, his movement fluid, unhurried. As he passed Penhaligon, the detective caught the scent of the tobacco again, mixed with something else, a bay rum or a soap that had not been diluted with filler. It was an assault on the senses, a reminder of a luxury that had been erased for everyone else. Penhaligon's hand twitched inside his pocket, his fingers brushing the edge of his ration book, the thin paper crinkling under the pressure of his thumb. He wanted to pull it out. He wanted to show the stamps, the cuts, the evidence of the shared deprivation that bound the rest of the city together, but he kept his hand buried deep in the lining. Clay stopped at the door. He raised his left hand to his cuff, adjusting the link with a deliberate slowness that suggested he had all the time in the world. The metal glinted, gold or perhaps gilt, catching the dim light before disappearing under the sleeve. It was a small gesture, insignificant to anyone else, but to Penhaligon it screamed of a life uninterrupted. While men queued for bread and women patched trousers with flour sacks, this man polished his cuffs and smoked imported leaf. The injustice of it rose in Penhaligon's throat, acidic and hot, but he swallowed it down, adding it to the sedimentary layer of words he had never spoken. "Mrs. Vance," Clay said, without turning around, "the coal delivery is late." "I'll ring them, sir, soon as the lines are open." "See that you do, it's damp." He opened the door. The outside world rushed in, a gust of wet air that carried the smell of wet asphalt and exhaust fumes, cutting through the domestic stalemate of the hallway. The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the pavement outside, a grey curtain that obscured the street. Clay stepped across the threshold, opening a black umbrella with a sharp snap of ribs that echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. He did not look back. He did not offer a warning or a threat. He simply walked away, his shoes making no sound on the wet concrete of the path. The door clicked shut, the latch engaged with a solid, final sound. Mrs. Vance exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to deflate her entire frame. She picked up the cloth again and resumed wiping the table, scrubbing at the ink stain with renewed vigor, as if she could erase the last 5 minutes along with the spill. "He pays on Tuesdays," she said, her voice tight. "I told you." Penhaligon pushed himself off the wall. His legs felt stiff, the blood returning to his muscles with a prickling heat. He walked to the door, his hand reaching for the handle, but he paused before touching it. He could see the smear of condensation on the glass where Clay's breath had fogged the pane, a ghostly mark that would fade within seconds. "I know when he pays, Mrs. Vance." "Then you know I can't lose him." She didn't look up. "Not for you, not for anyone." "No one is asking you to lose him." Penhaligon opened the door. The cold hit him immediately, seeping through the wool of his suit, biting at his cheeks. The sound of the rain was louder out here, drowning out the ticking of the hallway clock. He stepped onto the pavement, the dampness soaking through the soles of his shoes almost instantly. "I'm just asking you to remember what you see." "I see a tenant," she said to the wood grain, "nothing more." The queue outside Mrs. Prout's Cafe Tilda copyright coiled around the corner like a gutted serpent, grey wool and hunched shoulders shivering under the eaves. Rain needled the neck. Penhaligon kept his distance, letting 3 women with string bags and a boy in oversized trousers stand between him and the target. The black umbrella stood propped against the window frame, dripping a steady rhythm onto the sill, a dark exclamation mark in a sentence of grime. Inside, the glass fogged thick with breath and the steam of boiling tea, obscuring the room save for the blurred shapes of heads bent over chipped crockery. Penhaligon shifted his weight, the wet sole of his shoe squelching softly against the pavement. He watched through the condensation. Clay sat by the counter, back to the wall, facing the door. Not paranoia, habit. The man peeled off his gloves, finger by finger, laying them on the table with surgical precision before picking up his spoon. He stirred his tea, clockwise, 3 turns. Stop. Hungry work, standing about, a voice muttered at Penhaligon's elbow. Constable Gower. The young man smelled of damp dog and cheap peppermint, his uniform cape heavy with water that ran in rivulets down to his boots. He didn't look at Penhaligon, keeping his eyes fixed on the back of a newsstand further down the street, feigning an interest in the headlines about the Berlin airlift. Cold work, Penhaligon corrected. His voice came out flat, stripped of warmth by the wind. Hunger is different. Gower swallowed, the movement visible in his thin throat, before he spoke. He's been in 10 minutes, hasn't ordered yet, just sitting. He's waiting for the rush to die down. Or for us to move. Penhaligon didn't answer. Inside, Mrs. Prout emerged from the kitchen door, a stout woman whose apron was stained with the grease of 1,000 fry-ups. She carried a plate, not the standard ration fare of 1 egg and a sliver of bacon that adorned every other table. This plate held a mound of scrambled eggs, yellow and glistening, topped with 2 slices of toast that steamed in the cool air. Butter shone on the crusts, a golden luxury that made Penhaligon's stomach clench with a physical ache. She set it before Clay. She said something, her head dipping low, a deference that belonged to a different century, a different hierarchy. Clay nodded once. He picked up his fork. Bloody hell, Gower whispered, the words slipping out sharp and jagged before he could stop them. That's enough for a week. He stared, bewildered. Where did she get it? Back kitchen, Penhaligon said. He watched Mrs. Prout return to the stove, wiping her hands on her apron, her face unreadable. She keeps a stash for friends. Friends, Gower's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble. He's the enemy, sir. He wore their uniform. He swore oaths to them while boys from Bermondsey were dying in the mud because we didn't have the shells. Keep your voice down. It isn't right. Gower shifted, his hand drifting instinctively towards his truncheon before he caught himself and let it fall back to his side. We're watching him starve, according to the file. That's what Holloway said. Cut off the supplies, squeeze him out. But look at him, he's dining like a director. Penhaligon felt the familiar rise of bile, the acidic burn of complicity. He knew the file. He had written the recommendations that suggested tightening the noose on Clay's rations, believing that scarcity would force a mistake, a black market deal, a slip. Instead, it seemed scarcity only deepened the loyalty of those who remembered the old order, or perhaps those who simply feared the man who had worn the death's head. The bread on Clay's plate was white. Real white flour, not the grey, chalky substitute that crumbled in the mouth like dust. Clay cut a piece, lifted it to his lips, and chewed with a slow, deliberate enjoyment that felt like an obscenity. He knows we're here, Penhaligon said. Gower flinched. How? He hasn't looked at the window, not once. Penhaligon pressed his hand against the cold glass, leaving a smudge of palm print that quickly fogged over. If he were innocent or afraid, he'd check the reflection. He'd watch the street. He's eating because he knows he's safe, because we are the ones who are trapped. Trapped. In the rules. As Penhaligon pulled his hand away, the cold bit into his skin. We can't go in there. No warrant, no complaint, for he's a British citizen, Gower, who pays his taxes and eats his eggs. It makes me sick. Then don't watch. I can't help it. Gower turned finally, his eyes red-rimmed and wet. Whether from rain or rage it was impossible to tell. My brother died at Arnhem, just a boy, and this traitor gets extra butter. Penhaligon looked at the young constable, really looked at him, seeing the raw, unhealed wound of the war that still festered beneath the uniform. He wanted to offer comfort, to speak of the greater game, of the need for patience, of the intricate web of intelligence that required Clay to remain free so that others might be caught. But the words tasted like ash. They were the lies of the office, the bureaucratic salve applied to moral rot. Finish your shift, Thomas, Penhaligon said softly, urging him to go round the back and check the bins to see what she was throwing out. Gower blinked, sir. If she has extra stock, there's a source, black market connections, that's a crime we can touch. Penhaligon kept his eyes on Clay, who was now wiping his mouth with a napkin, folding it neatly beside the empty plate. Find the supplier, don't touch the woman, just the name. Gower hesitated, the conflict warring in his posture, the desire for justice battling the fear of insubordination. Then he nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. He stepped away from the window, merging into the flow of pedestrians, his cape swirling behind him like a dark wing. Penhaligon remained. Clay stood up. He placed money on the table of coins that glinted silver, not the dull bronze of devalued currency. He picked up his umbrella. He turned to the door. Penhaligon stepped back, retreating into the shadow of a doorway as the bell above the Cafe Tilde copyright entrance jingled. Clay pushed out into the rain, snapping the umbrella open with that same precise violence. He walked past Penhaligon's hiding place without a glance, the scent of fresh coffee and egg wafting after him, momentarily masking the smell of wet wool and coal smoke. The detective waited until the black umbrella had turned the corner before he moved. His legs felt heavy, leaden, as if the gravity of the city had increased solely for him. He walked to the Cafe Tilde copyright door and pushed it open. The warmth hit him, cloying and thick, with the smell of frying fat. Mrs. Prout stood behind the counter, scrubbing the spot where Clay's plate had been. She didn't look up. Closed for cleaning, she said. Her voice was hard, defensive. Just a tea, Penhaligon lied, for he didn't want tea but rather to see the bin, to witness the proof of the hoard. And a word about the bread. Mrs. Prout stopped scrubbing. She looked at him then, her eyes small and dark in her flour-dusted face. There was no fear there, only a weary resignation, the same look Mrs. Vance had worn in the hallway. Bread is bread, detective. Some get more, some get less. That's how it is. Where did you get the flour? Does it matter? She asked, tossing the cloth into the sink. He pays, he's quiet, and he doesn't trouble the neighbors, so what more do you want? I want to know who is breaking the law. Law, she spat the word. The law didn't feed my kids when the docks were bombed. The law didn't stop the bombs falling. Don't talk to me about the law. Penhaligon stood silent. The argument died in his throat, strangled by the truth of her words. He turned and walked out, the bell jingling mockingly behind him. The rain had eased to a mist, hanging in the air like a suspended breath. He walked back towards the bus stop, his mind already drafting the report. Subject: consumed meal at Mrs. Prout's Cafe Tilde copyright. Suspected black market activity. Source unidentified. The words felt hollow, a parody of justice. He reached into his pocket for his notebook, his fingers brushing the ration book again. He pulled it out, the thin paper limp with moisture. He opened it to the current page, staring at the stamps, the official marks of a system that worked for everyone except those it was meant to protect. A bus rumbled past, splashing dirty water onto the curb, and Penhaligon stepped back to avoid the spray. He watched the vehicle disappear into the grey, its tail lights glowing like dull embers, knowing he needed to file the log. He needed to return to Whitehall, to the warmth of the office and the safety of the paperwork, yet as he turned to walk, a thought snagged in his mind, a small jagged edge in the smooth surface of the day. The address. On the file, Clay was registered at 42 Lambeth Walk, but the boarding house register, the one Mrs. Vance had signed, listed him at 42B, a discrepancy. Minor, insignificant unless it wasn't, unless the bureaucracy had already lost him and Penhaligon had been watching a ghost while the real man slipped through the cracks of the city. He stopped. Looking down at the notebook in his hand, he saw the ink smudging in the damp. He tightened his grip until the paper crumpled, realizing the file was wrong. And if the file was wrong, then everything else was a lie. The coins bit into her thumb, cold and heavy, smelling of copper and the damp wool of her gloves. Mrs. Ilara Vance sat at the scarred kitchen table, the single paraffin lamp casting a jaundiced light over the pile of silver and bronze that represented the house's survival for another week. 1 shilling, 2 florins, 6pence. She stacked them with arthritic precision, her knuckles swollen and purple like old bruises, counting not just currency, but the margin between warmth and the creeping frost that waited in the unlit grates of the upstairs rooms. Clay's rent. It always arrived on Tuesday, tucked inside a plain white envelope. No note, no greeting, just the crisp rustle of solvency in a city drowning in debt. If this money vanished, so did the coal delivery on Thursday, and Mrs. Gable in the attic would spend another night coughing up black phlegm while the damp ate the plaster from the ceiling. She could not afford morality. Morality did not keep the pipes from bursting. She stood, the chair legs scraping harsh against the linoleum, and moved to the window. Through the gap in the lace curtains, the street below was a smear of grey and shadow. There he was, Penhaligon. He paced the pavement opposite the gate, a slight, hunched figure in a navy suit that had seen better decades, his breath pluming white in the chill air before dissipating into the smog. He looked like a man waiting for a bus that had ceased running years ago, shoulders pulled tight against a wind that blew from the inside out. Resentment flared in her chest, hot and sudden. What right did he have to stand there shivering, judging the contents of her house, threatening the fragile equilibrium she had built from silence and neglect? He wanted ghosts. She needed tenants. Let the government pay for the coal if they wanted the truth. Until then, the dead could stay buried. The front door clicked open. The sound was soft, practiced, devoid of the slam that marked the return of a working man. Clay entered the hallway, humming a tuneless melody that drifted through the floorboards, a casual, off-key warble that made her skin prickle. She waited a moment, letting the sound settle, then poured the tea. The pot was chipped, the liquid weak and brown, but it was hot. She carried the tray out, her steps deliberate on the runner, announcing her presence so he would not be startled. He stood by the coat stand, removing his gloves with slow, methodical tugs, his face smooth and unreadable as polished stone. "Tea, Mr. Clay," she said, her voice flat, stripping it of any inflection that might invite conversation. "It's cold enough to freeze the breath in your lungs." He turned, offering a smile that did not reach his eyes, a polite masking of features belonging to a different era, a different world. "You are too kind, Mrs. Vance, truly. The air is biting today." His fingers, long and pale and unmarked by labor, took the cup. "Did anyone call? Any post?" "No one," she lied, the words tasting like ash, "just the usual bills." She watched him sip, the steam rising between them, a barrier of vapor. He did not ask about the detective pacing the street. He did not ask about the whispers in the queue at the butcher's, the way people stepped aside when he approached, giving him a wide berth as if his coat carried a contagion. They both knew that was the arrangement. She provided the roof, he provided the rent, and neither of them spoke the name of the uniform he had worn when the world was burning. It was a silence constructed brick by brick, mortar mixed with fear, keeping the horror of his past from seeping into the floorboards and rotting the foundation of her home. He finished the tea in 3 swift draughts, placed the cup on the saucer with a precise click, and nodded. "I shall be retiring early. The paperwork at the office is tedious." He turned towards the stairs, his movement fluid, almost silent. "Good night, Mrs. Vance." "Good night," she murmured, watching him ascend. He missed a step, or perhaps the fabric of his trouser leg caught, for a small, rectangular object fluttered from his breast pocket and landed face down on the hallway runner. He did not notice. The door to his room closed softly, the lock engaging with a finality that echoed in the empty hall. Ilara waited until the floorboards above ceased their creaking before she moved. She approached the object, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a bird trapped in a cage of bone. It was a photograph. She picked it up, the cardstock stiff and glossy. The image was black and white, sharp in its cruelty. A man stood in a courtyard, snow on the ground, wearing the uniform of the British Free Corps. The runes on the collar were distinct, jagged lightning bolts that seemed to burn even in the dim light of the hall. It was Clay, younger, harder, his arm raised in a salute that made her stomach turn over. The background showed a building she recognized from the newsreels, a place where people disappeared and never came back. Her thumb traced the edge of the photo, feeling the sharp cut of the paper. This was it, the proof. The thing that would send him away, perhaps to the gallows, perhaps to a prison island where the sea ate the cliffs. Penhaligon would pay for this. The police would cheer. The neighbors would finally sleep without checking their locks 3 times a night. She looked at the stairs, then at the front door. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the pane. Inside, the house held its breath, If she gave this to Penhaligon, the rent stopped, the coal stopped, Mrs. Gable froze, the bank would come for the house, and she would be out on the street with her arthritis and her widow's pension, a burden on a state that had already forgotten her husband's name. Justice was a luxury for those who could afford to eat. Survival was a dirty business, conducted in shadows and behind skirting boards. She dropped to her knees, the joints popping in protest, and crawled to the wall. Her fingers found the gap where the wood had warped away from the plaster, a dark fissure near the floor. She slid the photograph into the void, pushing it deep until it vanished into the dust and darkness of the structure. It was gone, walled up, just another secret in a city built on them. She stood, brushing the dust from her skirt while her hands trembled slightly, the act feeling heavier than the coins as a physical weight settled on her shoulders. She had chosen, there was no going back now. The silence was no longer just an arrangement, for it had become a conspiracy. She turned to switch off the lamp and plunge the hall into gloom, but stopped when a knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps sounded, authoritative and impatient. It was not the postman, nor a neighbor, because she knew that rhythm as the sound of duty demanding an accounting. She smoothed her apron and took a breath that smelled of stale tea and hidden things before walking to the door. Through the frosted glass, the silhouette of a man in a hat was visible, waiting. She opened the latch just a crack, the chain still secure. "Mrs. Vance," Penhaligon's voice was muffled by the wood, tired and expectant. "It's late. I wondered if you'd noticed anything unusual, any visitors, or perhaps something Mr. Clay might have dropped." Ilara gripped the edge of the door, her knuckles white, the lie forming on her tongue like a second nature. "No one, detective," she said, her voice steady, betraying nothing of the photograph now resting in the dark behind the wall. "Just the wind, only the wind." The electric bulb overhead flickered, a nervous tick in the ceiling that cast the archive room into a strobing half-light, making the stacks of boxes appear to lurch forward, then retreat like breathing beasts. Penhaligon sat hunched over the desk, the wood cold against his forearms, surrounded by the dry, sour smell of decaying cellulose and the dust that had settled during the war years while men died in fields far from this quiet basement. He turned the page of the ledger before him, the paper brittle enough to crumble if handled with anything less than a surgeon's care, and felt the grit of old ink stain his fingertip. "Mrs. Gable," he whispered, the name tasting of ash. The letter lay open, dated November 1944, written in a looping, desperate hand that pressed hard into the cheap stationery, indenting the page beneath. It was from a mother in Leeds, asking for news of her son, Private Thomas Gable, last seen near Arnhem, a boy who had volunteered at 18 and vanished into the fog of a failed offensive. Penhaligon remembered filing it. He remembered the stamp he had used, the precise date, the box number assigned to ensure the correspondence was stored according to protocol, safe and sorted, and utterly useless. Now, 6 years later, the ink had faded to a rusty brown, but the plea remained sharp, a hook caught in the throat of the room. He traced the signature with a nail, feeling the ridge of the dried ink, and realized with a sudden, sickening clarity that he was sitting in a room full of ghosts, guarding the files of the dead, while the man who might have pulled the trigger walked free on a Lambeth street, buying his tobacco and nodding to neighbors. The weight of the single sheet felt immense, pressing against his sternum as though it were made of lead rather than wood pulp, dragging his breath short. He had spent the war here, in rooms like this, moving paper from one tray to another, believing that order was a form of virtue, that if the files were correct, then the world made sense. But the world did not make sense. The world allowed Douglas Burnville Clay to draw a ration book, while the Gables of Leeds received nothing but a standard form letter and a silence that stretched on until it became a permanent condition of their lives. Penhaligon reached for his pen, the instinct to annotate, to add a note, to do something rising in his throat like bile, but his hand hovered over the page, trembling. What could he write? File consulted. Subject at large. No action taken. The words would be true. They would also be a confession. A sound from the corridor broke the stillness, the sharp click of a heel on the linoleum that did not belong to the night cleaner, who shuffled in felt-soled slippers. Penhaligon froze, his hand instinctively darting to the inside pocket of his jacket, fingers brushing the stiff edge of his own ration book before he forced them still. The door handle turned, slowly, lacking the confident twist of someone who expected to be welcomed, and Holloway stepped into the room. The senior administrator wore his overcoat buttoned to the chin, though the basement was stiflingly warm, and his hat remained on his head, casting a shadow that obscured the upper half of his face. He did not look at Penhaligon immediately. His eyes scanned the rows of boxes, frantic and skipping, like a man searching for a lost watch in a field of long grass. "Holloway," Penhaligon said, his voice flat, betraying none of the jump that had seized his heart. "I wasn't expecting inspection tonight." Holloway flinched, a small, jerky movement of the shoulder that betrayed a nerve stretched too tight. He forced a smile, but it did not reach his eyes, which remained wide and darting. "Inspection? Good heavens, no, Arthur, merely a routine check. One hears rumors of damp in this wing, concerns about the preservation of state documents." He moved towards the desk, his steps hurried, lacking their usual measured pace, the heels clicking a rapid, uneven rhythm on the floor. "You're working late." Dedication is commendable, of course, but rest is also a requirement of the service. "The Gable file," Penhaligon said, tapping the letter with his index finger as he noted he was just reviewing the correspondence from 44. "It seems we missed a few connections. These concern the British Free Corps." The air in the room shifted, growing heavy and static, as before a thunderstorm that never breaks. Holloway stopped 3 feet from the desk, his hand hovering near his own breast pocket, then dropping quickly to his side. "The Free Corps files are restricted, Arthur. You know the directive, state-sensitive. They are not for general review, certainly not by a detective whose remit is surveillance, not historical analysis." "Surveillance requires context," Penhaligon replied, keeping his tone mild, the colorless diction of the civil servant masking the acid burning in his gut. "If I am to watch him, I must know what I am watching for. The mother in Leeds deserves more than a box number." "Mrs. Gable deserves peace," Holloway snapped, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the cold, hard fear beneath. He stepped forward, reaching across the desk, his fingers closing around the top sheet of the file Penhaligon had been reading. "And peace is maintained by knowing what to leave buried. This file is misplaced. It should have been transferred to the secure vault months ago. Carelessness, Arthur. We cannot afford carelessness." He yanked the folder from under Penhaligon's hand, the movement sharp and aggressive, causing the pen to roll off the desk and clatter onto the floor. Penhaligon did not move to retrieve it. He watched Holloway, noting the sheen of sweat on the administrator's upper lip, the way his breath came in short, shallow gasps despite the cool air of the corridor waiting behind him. This was not procedure. This was panic. Holloway was not retrieving a misplaced document. He was excising a tumor, removing the evidence that linked the intelligence failures of the war to the comfortable peace of the present. The man who had spoken of stability and ignoring ghosts was now terrified of the very shadows he had ordered Penhaligon to patrol. "Of course," Penhaligon said softly, leaning back in his chair, his posture slumping into the guise of the weary clerk, the harmless functionary. "My apologies, Edmund. The late hour, I lost track of the protocols." Holloway clutched the file to his chest, his knuckles white against the manila folder. "See that it doesn't happen again, Arthur. Go home, get some sleep. The city will still be here in the morning, and it requires us to be sharp." He turned abruptly, nearly colliding with the edge of the desk, and hurried towards the door, his coat tails swirling around his legs. "Lock up behind you and leave the ledger. I'll have it collected." The door slammed shut, the vibration rattling the loose pane in the frame, leaving Penhaligon alone in the flickering light. He waited, counting the seconds, listening to the retreating footsteps fade down the corridor until they were swallowed by the hum of the building's ventilation. Then he moved. He did not reach for the pen on the floor. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes scanning the spot where the file had lain. Beneath the folder, stuck to the desk surface by a patch of dried glue, was a thin sheet of carbon paper, and beneath that, a single slip of onion-skin tissue that Holloway had missed in his haste. Penhaligon peeled it free, the paper translucent and fragile. It was a carbon copy of the removal order, dated yesterday, signed by Holloway himself. But it was the annotation in the margin that stopped the breath in his lungs, a handwritten note in blue pencil that contradicted every public record he had ever seen. Subject BFC 009. Status, active asset, denazification waived, repurposed for intel. Clay was not a loose end. He was a tool, and Penhaligon had been assigned not to watch a criminal, but to guard a secret. He folded the slip of paper, small and tight, and slid it into his waistcoat pocket against his skin, where the heat of his body could warm the cold truth. The flickering bulb buzzed once, twice, then died, plunging the room into darkness, but he did not move to find the switch. He sat in the blackness, the smell of dust and decay filling his nose, and understood finally that the war had not ended. It had merely changed uniforms. The smell of stale beer and damp wool hit Gower first, a thick, cloying wall that settled on the back of his throat the moment he pushed through the heavy oak door of the King's Head. He did not pause to let his eyes adjust, did not wait for the landlord's nod, but moved with a jerky, predatory urgency that drew a flicker of attention from the few patrons huddled near the fire. There he was, Clay. Sitting in the corner booth, the one shadowed by the hanging ferns, a glass of something amber and illicit resting on the scarred table before him. Not the watery mild the ration allowed, but proper spirits, glowing like trapped sunlight in the gloom. Gower's hand tightened on the strap of his cap, the leather biting into his palm, a sharp, grounding pain that reminded him he was here against orders, here because Penhaligon's caution felt like suffocation, like watching a snake through a sheet of glass and refusing to strike. He weaved through the tables, his boots sticking slightly to the sawdust floor, and slid onto the bench opposite the traitor. Close, too close. The proximity made the air between them vibrate, charged with a danger Gower could taste, metallic and sharp, like sucking on a penny. Clay did not look up immediately. He continued to stir his drink with a small silver spoon, the metal chiming softly against the glass, a delicate, polite sound that seemed absurdly out of place in this grimy Southwark dive. "Cold out," Gower said, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it down, deeper, trying to mimic the rough cadence of the locals, the men who had actually fought. "Bit of a bite in the wind tonight." Clay stopped stirring. He lifted his head, and his eyes were not the wild, guilty things Gower had imagined in his nightmares, nor the fiery orbs of propaganda posters. They were flat, grey, and utterly empty, reflecting the dim gaslight without absorbing any of its warmth. A smile touched the man's lips, thin and precise, stretching the skin tight over teeth that were too white, too perfect for a city surviving on powdered egg and grey bread. "Is it?" Clay asked, his voice smooth, devoid of accent, belonging nowhere and everywhere all at once. "I hadn't noticed. One gets used to the chill, Constable. Eventually it feels like home." Gower flinched. The word hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Constable, not mate, not sir, not friend. The title was a blade, slipped neatly between the ribs of Gower's disguise. He had worn a civilian coat, a borrowed scarf, had taken care to smear a bit of coal dust on his cheekbone to roughen his appearance. Yet Clay had seen the uniform beneath the wool, the rigid spine, the way his eyes scanned the room for exits rather than companions. The young officer's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but he forced himself to lean forward, to rest his elbows on the sticky table, to pretend he hadn't just been stripped bare. "You know me then?" Gower asked, keeping his tone light, feigning a curiosity that felt like acid in his stomach. "Can't say I recall the face. New to the area, are we?" "We are all new to something, are we not?" Clay replied, taking a slow sip of his drink, his gaze never wavering from Gower's face. "Some of us are new to peace, others are new to guilt, and some—" He paused, setting the glass down with a soft click, the sound final as a coffin lid closing. "Some are simply new to the realization that they are out of their depth." The air in the pub seemed to thicken, the smoke from the pipes swirling in stagnant eddies around their heads. Gower could smell the tobacco on Clay's breath, rich and foreign, Turkish leaf perhaps, or something even more exotic, a scent that spoke of connections and privileges that ordinary men like him, men who queued for hours for a single ounce of shag, could only dream of. It was an insult, a flaunting of the very inequalities that made the war worth fighting, or so Gower had been told. His hand twitched, wanting to reach out, to grab the lapel of that impeccably tailored suit, to shake the truth out of the man until the polite mask cracked and the monster beneath screamed. "I heard stories," Gower said, the words tumbling out before he could check them, driven by a need to provoke, to see a flicker of fear, of shame, of anything human. "About the East Front, about men who wore the grey uniform but spoke with English tongues, men who stood beside the SS while our boys froze in the mud near Arnhem." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Men like Private Gable. Ever hear of him, Mr. Clay? Thomas Gable. He wrote letters home. Until he didn't. Clay's expression did not change. The smile remained, fixed and terrible, a plaster cast of civility. He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, not for a document, but for a handful of coins which he placed neatly on the table. The sound of metal on wood was sharp, cutting through the low murmur of the pub. The mud was very deep that year, Clay said softly, standing up with a fluid grace that belied his age. He buttoned his coat, adjusting the collar with a fastidious tug. And letters are fragile things, Constable. They burn quite easily, as do bridges, as do careers. He looked down at Gower, and for the first time the emptiness in his eyes seemed to shift, revealing a glint of something cold and predatory, a shark sensing blood in the water. You should finish your shift, Thomas. Go round the back, check the bins, see what she's throwing out. It's safer there, less chance of drowning. He turned and walked away, moving through the crowded room with an effortless authority that parted the patrons like water around a stone. No one looked at him. No one challenged him. They stared into their drinks, into the fire, into the middle distance, their eyes sliding off the man in the tailored suit as if he were invisible, as if the collective will of the room had agreed to simply erase him from existence. Gower sat frozen, his hands still half raised, his mouth open on a retort that would never come. The adrenaline that had fueled his entry now curdled in his gut, turning into a cold, heavy sludge of shame. He had blown it. He had walked into the lion's den wearing a lamb's skin and expected to bite the lion's ear off. And now the lion was gone, vanished into the fog outside, leaving Gower alone with the dregs of his own stupidity. The door swung shut behind Clay, the draft ruffling the ferns, and a moment later, the bell above the frame jingled again. Penhaligon stepped in. He did not rush. He did not scan the room with the frantic energy of a man hunting a suspect. He walked slowly, his shoulders hunched against a chill that existed only in his own bones, his eyes finding Gower immediately, pinpointing the young constable slumped at the table like a punctured balloon. The detective stopped beside the booth, looking down at the untouched pint Gower had ordered, at the coins Clay had left behind, gleaming accusingly in the dim light. He said nothing. He did not need to. The disappointment radiating from him was a physical weight, pressing down on Gower's chest, making it hard to breathe, harder still to meet the older man's gaze. He knew, Gower whispered, the admission tearing out of him, raw and ragged. He knew my name, sir. He knew about Gable. He knew everything. He looked up, his eyes wet, the bravado of 10 minutes ago shattered into dust. And he walked right out. He just walked out. Penhaligon sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of every file he had ever buried, every order he had ever obeyed. He reached out, his fingers brushing the coins on the table, then pulling back as if they burned. Of course he did, Thomas, he said quietly, his voice devoid of surprise, filled only with a terrible, sedimentary resignation. The question isn't how he knew. The question is why he wanted you to know he knew. He turned towards the door, towards the fog that had swallowed the traitor, his hand hovering near his own breast pocket where the carbon copy of the removal order lay hidden against his heart. Come along, the shift is over. There's nothing left to watch here but ourselves. The door latch clicked. Cold air rushed in to meet them, sharp with the scent of wet coal and river mud, stripping the warmth of the pub from Gower's skin like a layer of grease. He stepped onto the pavement, his boots slipping slightly on the slick stone, and pulled his collar up against the damp that seeped through the wool of his tunic. Penhaligon followed, closing the door softly behind them, the brass bell giving a final, mournful tinkle before the wood swallowed the sound of the landlord's radio inside. They walked. Southwark Street stretched ahead, a grey ribbon unspooling into the fog, the gas lamps reduced to fuzzy halos that failed to penetrate the gloom more than a few yards. Gower kept pace with the detective, matching his stride automatically, though every instinct screamed at him to run, to chase the shadow of the man in the tailored suit who had vanished into the mist only minutes before. His hands felt empty, useless. The adrenaline that had spiked in the booth had drained away, leaving a hollow ache in his muscles, a tremor in his fingers that he hid by clenching them into fists inside his pockets. He knew my mother's name, Gower said, the words hanging in the air like white vapor dissipating instantly. I didn't tell him, I didn't mention her. Penhaligon did not look at him. He kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead, navigating the cracks in the pavement with a familiarity that suggested he had walked this specific route 1,000 times in the dark. Names are cheap, Thomas. Information is the currency, and he has been spending it freely since 45. But how? Gower stopped, forcing the detective to halt and turn. The fog swirled around Penhaligon's ankles, clinging to the turned cuffs of his trousers, the mismatched fabric of his elbows visible as a dark patch in the gloom. We're supposed to be watching him, not the other way around. Are we? Penhaligon's voice was flat, devoid of the anger Gower expected, devoid of anything resembling comfort. He reached into his breast pocket, not to retrieve the file, but to adjust the lapel, a nervous tick that smoothed the wool over his heart. Surveillance is a two-way mirror, Constable. Often the man on the other side has a better view. They resumed walking. A lorry rumbled past, its tires hissing on the wet road, the driver invisible behind the steam clouding the windscreen, eyes fixed forward, ignoring the two policemen standing in the shadow of a boarded-up shopfront. The noise faded, leaving the silence heavier than before. Gower watched the detective's profile, the way the smog settled into the lines around his mouth, the sedimentary weariness that seemed carved into the bone itself. This was not a man surprised by betrayal. This was a man who expected it. You knew he'd react like that, Gower said. It wasn't a question. You knew he'd walk. I hoped he would. Penhaligon stopped at the corner of Borough High Street, waiting for the traffic light that wasn't working, staring at the empty crossroads as if the signal might miraculously change. If he runs, we have cause. If he fights, we have evidence. But if he walks, if he simply acknowledges you and leaves, he trailed off, shaking his head slowly. Then we know the boundaries of the cage. Who built it? Penhaligon looked at him then. The streetlight above them flickered, buzzing with a dying insect sound, casting jagged shadows across his face that made him look older, grayer, as though the light itself was draining the color from his skin. The same people who signed his denazification papers, the same people who file his reports under state sensitive and lock them in a drawer marked, "Do not open." He stepped off the curb, crossing the road without waiting for a gap in traffic, forcing a black taxi to swerve, the driver shouting a curse that was swallowed by the engine noise. Come along. Gower hurried to catch up, his heart thumping a hard, irregular rhythm against his ribs. The implications settled in his stomach like a stone. It wasn't just that Clay was protected, it was that the protection was active, operational, a living thing that breathed in the corridors of Whitehall while men like Gower froze on street corners. He thought of the coins Clay had left on the table. Clean, shiny, unrationed, money that shouldn't exist in a city scraping by on dried egg and powdered milk. The tobacco, Gower muttered. Turkish leaf, you saw it. I smelled it. Penhaligon turned down a narrower alley, a shortcut cutting through the market's rear where tarpaulins shrouded the stalls and the air hung thick with the rotting sweetness of discarded cabbage and wet cardboard. Imported, illegal. Yet he smokes it openly because he knows no one will stop him. He stopped walking to face Gower in the narrow passage, the brick walls closing in on either side to block out the wind. You asked him about Private Gable. Yes. And he told you letters burn. Penhaligon leaned against the wall, rough bricks scraping his shoulder, and his eyes closed for a brief second, as if the effort of staying awake was becoming too much. He wasn't threatening you, Thomas. He was informing you. Gable's letters didn't burn by accident. They were filed, and then they were lost. By who? By the men who want the war to stay over. Pushing off the wall, Penhaligon resumed the walk, his pace now quicker and urgent. We are not hunters, Constable, but archivists who record the decay without stopping it. They reached the end of the alley, emerging onto a main road where the fog was thinner, the lights of a passing bus glowing like a pair of angry eyes in the dark. Gower stopped, grabbing the detective's arm, the wool coarse and damp under his fingers. Then why do we do it? Why watch him if we can't touch him? Penhaligon looked down at the hand on his sleeve, then up at Gower's face. There was no pity in his eyes, only a terrible, exhausted clarity. Because someone has to remember, when the files are finally opened, when the men in the high chairs are dead and the excuses have rotted away, there needs to be a record that says we saw him, that we knew. He pulled his arm free, adjusting his jacket, his hand brushing the breast pocket where the carbon copy lay hidden. And because sometimes, Thomas, The archive is the only weapon that doesn't misfire. He started walking again, heading towards the station, leaving Gower standing on the pavement. The bus roared past, splashing dirty water onto the curb, soaking the bottom of Gower's trousers. He didn't move. He watched the detective's retreating figure, the slight hunch of the shoulders, the way he blended into the grey background of the city, becoming just another shadow among the many. Gower looked down at his own hands. They were shaking, not from cold, from the realization that the uniform he wore was not a shield but a label. He turned towards the station, following the trail of footsteps fading into the fog, knowing that tomorrow he would return to the booth in the pub, and the next day and the next, watching a man who knew his name while the city slept around them, blind and complicit. The fog closed in behind him, erasing the path they had walked, leaving only the sound of distant traffic and the quiet, persistent drip of water from a broken gutter. Scrubbing hard, the bristles of the coconut brush tore at the varnish, lifting a layer of dried egg yolk and grease that no amount of hot water could fully dissolve. Mrs. Agnes Prout worked the corner of table 4, her knuckles white against the black handle, the smell of burnt chicory and wet wool hanging heavy in the air, a scent that had seeped into the plasterwork and the curtains and the very fibers of her cardigan over the last 3 years. It was a smell of survival, of making do, of boiling bones twice to extract every ounce of flavor, before tossing them to the stray dogs that prowled the alley behind the kitchen door. She stopped, wiping her forehead with the back of a wrist that felt rough as sandpaper, and looked across the room. Clay sat by the window. He was eating his breakfast with a methodical slowness that suggested he was savoring the normalcy of the act, cutting his slice of national loaf into precise, geometric squares before lifting each one to his mouth with a fork that caught the grey morning light. He did not rush. He did not glance at the door. He did not seem to care that the world outside was still picking its way through the rubble of a war that had ended 4 years prior, or that the men who had fought it were still coming home in boxes, or with limbs missing, or with eyes that saw things no one else could see. He simply ate. The butter on his bread was real, not the yellow margarine that tasted of fish oil and disappointment, and the jam had a deep, ruby richness that spoke of fruit, picked in a summer before the rationing boards had taken hold of the sugar supply. Agnes watched his hands. They were clean. The nails were trimmed short, the skin pale and uncalloused, the hands of a man who had never dug a trench or hauled a crate of ammunition or held a dying boy while the medics screamed for morphine that wasn't there. Her own hands were red and cracked, the skin split at the cuticles from the soda crystals she used to scour the pots, and she felt a sudden, sharp spike of hatred so pure it made her breath catch in her throat. Her husband Frank had gone at Dunkirk. He had written her a letter from the beach, the paper stained with salt and blood, saying he would be home by Christmas. He never made it to the boats. Her son Billy had gone up in a Lancaster over Essen and had never come down, just a shower of sparks in the dark sky that the neighbors whispered about for weeks afterwards. They were gone, dust, names on a memorial stone that was already turning black with the smog. And this man, this Douglas Burnville Clay, whose name she had heard hissed in the queue at the butcher's and murmured behind hands in the church hall, sat in her caff, a tilde copyright eating real butter, while the widows of London counted their coupons and wondered if they could afford a second slice of toast. She should turn him out. She should take the bucket of soapy water and throw it in his face, tell him to get out and never come back, tell him that his kind was not welcome in a place where honest people tried to forget the war by drinking tea that tasted of dust. It would be easy. The other patrons, 2 clerks and an old man who read the racing form, would cheer. They would slap her on the back and buy her a glass of stout and tell her she was a patriot, a good woman, a defender of the realm. But he paid. He placed the exact change on the table every morning, never short, never asking for credit, never complaining when the bread was stale or the milk was watered down. He tipped too, a copper penny, sometimes a threepenny bit, left neatly beside the saucer, a small fortune in a week where the coal bill was overdue and the rent collector was due on Friday. He was quiet. He did not talk to the other customers. He did not boast. He did not wear his past on his sleeve like some of the demobbed lads who came in drunk and loud, demanding respect for uniforms they had worn for 6 months before getting a blighty one. Clay just sat, he ate, he left. Agnes picked up the teapot. It was chipped at the spout, the floral pattern faded to a ghost of its former self, and she walked over to his table, her feet aching in shoes that had been resoled so many times the leather was thinner than paper. "More tea, Mr. Clay." He looked up. His eyes were a light, watery blue, devoid of any obvious malice, any hint of the monster the whispers described. There was no fire there, no hatred, just a calm, unsettling emptiness, like a room that had been cleared of furniture and swept clean. "Please, Mrs. Prout, that would be most kind." His voice was soft, educated, the vowels rounded and precise, the sort of voice that belonged in a drawing room with a fire roaring in the grate and a decanter of sherry on the sideboard, not in a damp Cafe Tilda copyright in Lambeth where the ceiling leaked when it rained and the floorboards groaned under the weight of too many sorrowful stories. She poured the tea. The liquid was dark, almost black, steeped so long it had turned bitter, but he did not flinch. He lifted the cup with both hands, warming his palms against the ceramic, and took a sip. "Thank you," he said. "It hits the spot." She nodded, unable to speak, and turned away, her heart hammering a hard, irregular rhythm against her ribs, a traitorous beat that felt like shame. She went back to the counter, picking up the rag to wipe a spot that was already clean, her eyes drifting to the corner of the room where the shadows were deepest. Penhaligon sat there. He had entered without the bell above the door making a sound, slipping inside like a draught of cold air, and had taken the seat furthest from the light. He had a cup of tea in front of him, but it was cold. She had watched him sit there for 20 minutes without lifting the cup, his eyes fixed on Clay with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thick, charged with a tension that made the other patrons lower their voices and hunch their shoulders as if expecting a bomb to drop. He did not look like a policeman. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to stand up straight, his navy suit hanging off his slight frame, the elbows patched with fabric that did not quite match, his face a map of sedimentary weariness that suggested he had spent a lifetime swallowing words that were too dangerous to speak aloud. Clay finished his toast. He dabbed his mouth with a paper napkin, folding it into a perfect square before placing it beside his plate. He stood up, pulling on a coat that was of a quality Agnes had not seen in years, the wool thick and fine, the cut tailored to hide the slight paunch of middle age. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the coins, placing them on the table with a soft clink. Then he turned to her. "Good day, Mrs. Prout. The tea was excellent." He nodded. It was a genuine nod, a small dip of the chin that conveyed a specific, polite gratitude, the kind of manners her father had taught her before the war took everything else. And in that moment, Agnes felt a jolt that made her stomach turn over. He was capable of kindness. He was capable of politeness. He was not a demon with horns and a tail, not a caricature of evil that could be easily dismissed. He was a man. A man who had worn the uniform of the enemy, a man who had betrayed his country, a man who might have signed the papers that sent boys like Billy to their deaths. And yet he stood here, thanking her for a cup of bitter tea with a sincerity that felt more dangerous than any threat. It made his past crimes even more incomprehensible and difficult to process than simple monsterhood. A monster you could hate, a monster you could fight, but a man who said thank you, a man who ate his breakfast with good manners, that was a thing that cracked the foundation of the world, that suggested evil was not a separate species, but a choice made by people who walked among you, who paid their rent and tipped their waitresses and smiled when it rained. Clay turned and walked out the door, the bell finally chiming as the latch clicked shut. The sound seemed too loud in the sudden quiet of the Cafe Tilda copyright. The clerks went back to their eggs. The old man rustled his newspaper. The tension broke, dissipating like smoke in a draught. Except for Penhaligon. He did not move. He waited until the sound of Clay's footsteps had faded completely from the pavement outside, until the bus had roared past and swallowed the street in noise, before he stood up. He walked to the counter, his movements slow and deliberate, as if every step cost him energy he did not have. He stopped in front of Agnes, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on her face. "Mrs. Prout," he said, his voice low, a murmur that barely rose above the hum of the refrigerator. "Do you know where he goes after breakfast?" Agnes froze. The rag in her hand felt heavy, soaked with water and grease. She looked at the door, then back at the detective, seeing the exhaustion in his face, the desperate need in his eyes that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with a burden he could not put down. She thought of the coins on the table, the real butter, the polite nod. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat, caught between the duty of a citizen and the survival of a woman who needed the rent paid on time. The silence he left behind was not empty. It was heavy, pressing against the eardrums like the change in pressure before a storm, filled with the ghost of his polite voice and the lingering scent of that impossible, thick wool coat. Agnes gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles whitening as the wood bit into her palms, trying to anchor herself against the sudden tilting of her world. He had thanked her. The sheer audacity of it, the normalcy, made her want to scream until the windows rattled in their frames. Penhaligon stood waiting, a grey statue in a room that had suddenly started breathing again, his patience a physical weight she could feel on her skin. He did not blink. He did not shift his stance. He simply existed there, a monument to the bureaucratic inertia that kept men like Clay walking free on Lambeth streets while boys rotted in unmarked grave across the channel. "I don't know," she said. The lie came out too fast, sharp and brittle, shattering the quiet before she could soften the edges. Penhaligon's eyes narrowed, just a fraction, the skin around them crinkling in a way that suggested he had heard every variation of deception the city had to offer and found them all tedious. He took a half-step closer, the smell of damp wool and stale tobacco rising from his suit, a scent that spoke of long hours spent in unventilated rooms and bus stops where the rain never quite stopped falling. "He comes here every Tuesday and Thursday," Penhaligon said, his voice dropping lower, forcing her to lean in to catch the words, an intimacy she did not want. "He orders the same meal. He leaves the same tip. He walks out that door with a purpose that suggests he has somewhere to be, yet my man on the corner loses him every time within 2 blocks. He paused, letting the accusation hang in the air between them, thick as the steam rising from the urn behind her. "You see him more than I do, Mrs. Prout. You see him when he thinks no one is watching. You see the man behind the mask." Agnes looked down at the rag in her hand, at the dark stain of grease that had seeped through the fabric and onto her thumb. She thought of Billy, lost somewhere over the Ruhr Valley, his plane torn apart by flak, his body never recovered, just a name on a piece of paper sent to her in an envelope that felt too light to hold such a catastrophe. She thought of Arthur, drowned in the cold grey water off Dunkirk, his last letters speaking of the mud and the cold, and the hope of coming home to her, and the Caf Atilda copyright they were going to build together. They were dead, they were gone, and the man who had worn the enemy's uniform, who had perhaps pointed a finger at men like them, was sitting in her Caf Atilda copyright eating toast with real butter. "He pays his rent," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Mrs. Vance says he pays on Tuesdays, always on time." Penhaligon let out a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any humor. "Rent," he repeated, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. "Yes, the economy of the Traitor is quite robust, isn't it? They always have the coins, and they always have the warm coat." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter, invading her space with a desperation that made her want to step back, but held her feet rooted to the linoleum. "I am not asking about his rent, Mrs. Prout. I am asking about his life. Does he meet anyone? Does he speak to the newsagent? Does he take a bus, a train, a taxi? Where does a man go when he has no job, no family, and a past that would see him hanged if the wind blew the right way?" Agnes swallowed, her throat tight. She could tell him. She could describe the way Clay walked, the direction he turned, the specific shop where he bought his tobacco that smelled of foreign spice and money. She could give Penhaligon the thread he needed to pull, the one that might unravel the whole tangled mess and bring some semblance of justice to a world that felt increasingly devoid of it. But then she saw the coins again, sitting on the table where Clay had left them. Shiny, silver, real, enough to buy coal for the stove next week, enough to keep the lights on when the ration coupons ran out, enough to survive another month in a city that was slowly crumbling around them, brick by brick. If Clay went to prison, who would take the room? Another stranger? Another ghost? Or would the room sit empty, a drain on her resources, a reminder of the peace that had cost them everything? "He walks," she said finally, her voice steady now, stripped of the tremor that had threatened to betray her. "He just walks, down the road towards the river. He likes the water, I think." Penhaligon studied her face, his gaze piercing, stripping away the layers of her defense until she felt naked and exposed. He knew she was lying, or at least, he knew she was withholding. The weariness in his eyes deepened, settling into the lines around his mouth like sediment in a stagnant pond. "The river," he said softly, "a popular destination for men with nowhere else to go." He pushed himself away from the counter, straightening his jacket with an automatic gesture that spoke of a lifetime of trying to maintain appearances in a world that had lost all sense of order. He reached into his pocket, not for a notebook or a warrant, but for a single, crumpled coin which he placed on the counter between them. "For the tea," he said, "even if I didn't drink it." He turned and walked towards the door, his shoulders hunched against a chill that existed only in his own bones. The bell chimed again, a bright, cheerful sound that clashed violently with the gloom of the Caf A Tilde copyright. Agnes watched him go, watching the navy suit disappear into the grey mist of the street, leaving her alone with the smell of burnt chicory and the weight of her choice. She picked up the coin he had left, feeling the cold metal warm against her palm. It was a shilling, more than the tea was worth, a tip from a man who had nothing. She looked at the door, then at the table where Clay had sat. The napkin was still there, folded into its perfect square, a monument to good manners, a testament to the fact that monsters did not roar. They thanked you for the service. They paid on time, and they walked free into the fog while the widows scrubbed the tables and tried to forget the faces of the dead. She crushed the napkin in her fist, the paper tearing under the pressure, and threw it into the bin beneath the counter. The sound was small, insignificant, swallowed instantly by the hum of the refrigerator and the murmur of the patrons returning to their eggs. Outside, the bus roared past again, shaking the windows in their frames, blotting out the street, blotting out the choice, blotting out the truth. The door to Holloway's office stuck on the warped floorboards, requiring a shoulder check that jarred Penhaligon's collarbone before it gave way with a splintering crack. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of pale light cutting through the smog-grimed window, illuminating the stack of manila folders on the administrator's desk like a shrine to inertia. Penhaligon stepped inside, the carbon copy of the surveillance file heavy in his hand, its edges sharp against his palm where the paper had been folded and refolded until the ink began to flake. He did not wait for an invitation to sit. He walked to the desk and laid the file down, the impact sending a small cloud of dust rising from the leather blotter, settling slowly on the pristine surface of Holloway's fountain pen. "It is all there," Penhaligon said, his voice low but carrying a tremor that vibrated in the small space between them. "Every meeting, every purchase. The tobacco alone would hang him if the court cared about black market goods, let alone the uniform he wore while British boys froze in the Ardennes." Holloway looked up from the document he had been reading, his spectacles sliding down the bridge of a nose that seemed too soft for the hardness of his profession. He did not reach for the file. He did not even glance at it. Instead, he removed his glasses, wiped them slowly with a handkerchief that smelled faintly of lavender and stale tobacco, and placed them back with deliberate precision. "Arthur," Holloway said, the name dropping into the room like a stone into a deep well. "You must understand that the stability of the peace relies less on the punishment of every sin and more on the capacity of the living to ignore the ghosts walking beside them." Penhaligon felt the heat rise in his cheeks, a flush of anger that felt alien against his usual pallor, burning him from the inside out. He leaned forward, planting his hands on the desk, knuckles white against the dark wood. "Ghosts do not buy Turkish tobacco with pre-war gold coins, Edmund. Ghosts do not walk down Lambeth High Street in tailored suits while widows patch their husbands' old trousers with sackcloth. This man is breathing. He is eating. He is living on the same air as the families of the men he helped kill." "And if we drag him into the light?" Holloway asked, his tone weary, as though explaining arithmetic to a child who refused to learn. If we open the file, Arthur, we must also open the files on how we knew he was there. We must explain why intelligence services tracked the British Free Corps movements in 44 and 45 and did nothing until the shooting stopped. We must reveal that some of the men who walked away from those camps were not prisoners, but assets. The word hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Assets, men measured in utility rather than guilt. Penhaligon straightened up, his spine cracking softly, a sound like a dry twig snapping underfoot. He wanted to shout. He wanted to overturn the desk, to scatter the papers, to scream until the walls of Whitehall shook and the people outside stopped their queuing and looked up. But the training held him, the protocol. The deep, sedimentary weariness that had built up over years of swallowing words too dangerous to speak. Truth matters, Penhaligon said, though the conviction in his voice was already fracturing, leaking away like water from a cracked cup. It has to matter. If we cannot say what is true, then what are we doing here? What was the war for? Holloway sighed, a long exhalation that seemed to deflate his entire frame. He reached into the top drawer of his desk, the wood groaning in protest, and withdrew a single sheet of paper. It was typed on official Home Office stationery, the header stark and black. He slid it across the desk, the paper whispering against the leather, stopping just inches from Penhaligon's trembling fingers. "This is the report," Holloway said. "It states that Douglas Burnville Clay poses no current threat to national security. It states that his previous affiliations were coerced and that he has since demonstrated exemplary conduct as a civilian. It states that further surveillance is a waste of resources best deployed elsewhere." Penhaligon looked at the paper. The words swam before his eyes, blurring into a grey mass of lies. He knew every syllable was false. He knew that signing it would be an act of complicity, a betrayal of the dead whose names he had filed away in the basement archives. He looked at Holloway, expecting to see malice in the administrator's eyes, but found only a tired resignation, a mirror of his own exhaustion. "If I do not sign it," Penhaligon asked, the question barely a whisper. "Then another will," Holloway replied, his voice flat, "and you will be reassigned to traffic duties in Croydon, and Clay will still walk free, only now he will do so without anyone watching to ensure he does not slip again. Is that the justice you seek, Arthur, to be removed from the board while the game continues?" Penhaligon stared at the pen sitting next to the report. It was a sleek, black instrument, expensive, likely a gift from a department head who never had to dirty his hands with the reality of the streets. He picked it up. The metal was cold, heavy, feeling less like a tool of writing and more like a weapon. He uncapped it, the click sounding loud in the silence of the room. Outside, the muffled roar of a bus passed by, shaking the window pane, rattling the glass in its frame. He looked out at the smog, a thick, yellow-gray blanket that obscured the city, hiding the streets, the people, the truth. His hand moved. The nib touched the paper. The ink flowed, black and permanent, forming his signature in the designated box. It looked like his handwriting, yet it felt as though someone else had guided the pen, a puppet master pulling strings attached to his bones. The signature dried quickly in the dry heat of the office, a final seal on a coffin he had helped build. "There," Holloway said, taking the paper and placing it neatly back in the drawer, closing it with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot. "Thank you, Arthur. You may go." Penhaligon turned away from the desk, his legs feeling stiff, uncooperative. He walked to the door, the floorboards creaking under his weight, each step an effort. He opened the door and stepped out into the corridor, the air cooler here, smelling of floor wax and old cabbage. He walked down the hall, past the rows of offices where other men sat at other desks, signing other lies, building a wall of paper high enough to keep the truth out. He reached the staircase and began to descend, his hand trailing along the banister, feeling the smooth, worn wood under his fingertips. At the bottom, he pushed open the heavy front door and stepped out onto the pavement. The smog hit him immediately, damp and acrid, coating his throat, stinging his eyes. He pulled his collar up, turning towards the street. Below, on the sidewalk across the road, a figure emerged from the mist, Douglas Burnville Clay. He was wearing a grey overcoat, well cut, and a hat pulled low over his brow. He was not alone. A woman walked beside him, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps a friend. Clay was speaking, his head tilted towards her, and then he laughed. It was a clear, bright sound cutting through the drone of the traffic, a sound of pure, unburdened joy. He laughed as though he had nothing to hide, as though the war had never happened. As though the dead were merely statistics in a file that had been closed and put away. Penhaligon stood frozen on the step, watching them walk away together, disappearing into the grey fog of London, leaving him alone with the weight of the signature drying in his pocket. The ink sat wet on the page, a black wound that refused to clot. Penhaligon stared at it, the letters of his own name twisting into something alien, a signature forged by a stranger who wore his skin but lacked his spine. The cap clicked back onto the pen, a sharp, final sound that echoed the drawer sliding shut. Holloway did not look up. He was already arranging a stack of folders, aligning their edges with a geometric precision that suggested the world could be ordered if one simply ignored the bloodstains on the carpet. "Dismissed, Detective," Holloway said, his voice devoid of triumph, stripped of malice, reduced to the flat tone of a man ordering more coal for the boiler. Penhaligon's throat worked. He wanted to speak, to unleash the torrent of accusations that had built up behind his teeth for weeks, the names of the boys who rotted in French mud while Clay drank wine in a requisitioned chateau. But the air in the room felt thick, pressurized, as though the walls were closing in to crush any dissent before it could form a shape. He turned. His boots made no sound on the linoleum, which was scuffed white at the corners where 1,000 weary feet had shuffled towards compromise. The corridor stretched out, a long tunnel of beige paint and flickering fluorescent tubes that buzzed like dying insects. He walked, one foot, then the other. The rhythm was mechanical, a puppet's gait dictated by the string of protocol he had just tightened around his own neck. Offices lined the hall, doors ajar, revealing glimpses of other men in grey suits, heads bowed over papers that likely contained similar lies, similar erasures, similar acts of administrative mercy that felt indistinguishable from treason. A typewriter clattered somewhere, a frantic staccato beat that sounded like laughter. He reached the staircase. The banister was smooth, worn down by the palms of civil servants who had climbed these steps hoping to serve justice and descended knowing they served only the state. His hand grazed the wood, feeling the grease of previous tenants, the accumulated grime of a decade of difficult decisions. Down he went, step by heavy step, the concrete vibrating slightly under his weight. The smell of the building changed as he descended, shifting from the dry dust of paper to the damp, fungal scent of the ground floor, mingling with the odor of wet wool and boiled cabbage that drifted up from the canteen below. At the bottom, the heavy double doors loomed, painted a glossy green that chipped around the handles. He pushed. The hinges groaned, a low, protesting complaint that seemed to articulate everything he could not say. Outside, London waited. The sky was a uniform sheet of bruised purple pressing down on the rooftops, squeezing the light out of the afternoon. The smog was thicker now, a yellow-grey soup that clung to the brickwork, tasting of sulfur and unburnt coal, coating the back of his tongue with a film of grit. He stood on the top step, pulling his collar up against the damp chill that penetrated the thin wool of his suit. The street was a blur of motion, shadows shifting within the fog, the shapes of buses and lorries emerging like leviathans from the deep before vanishing again into the murk. The roar of traffic was constant, a dull thrum that vibrated in the soles of his feet, indifferent to the small tragedies playing out on the pavements. Then a shape resolved itself from the gloom. Across the road, emerging from the mist near the bus stop, walked a man in a grey overcoat. The cut was impeccable, the fabric holding a sheen that spoke of foreign tailoring, of connections that bypassed the rationing boards and the queuing crowds. A hat sat low on his brow, shadowing the face, but Penhaligon knew the set of those shoulders, the slight, arrogant tilt of the head. Douglas Burnville Clay. He was not alone. A woman walked beside him, her arm linked through his, a gesture of casual intimacy that struck Penhaligon like a physical blow. She was laughing at something he had said, her head thrown back, the sound carrying across the empty stretch of tarmac, clear and bright and terrible. Clay turned to her, his face illuminated for a second by the flare of a match as he lit a cigarette. The flame revealed the features, the pale skin, the calm eyes, the mouth curved in a smile of genuine amusement. He looked happy. The cigarette glowed orange in the gloom, a tiny, defiant star in the grey afternoon. Clay took a long drag, the smoke curling around his head, mixing with the fog, and then he exhaled, a slow, relaxed stream that vanished into the air. He said something else, leaning closer to the woman, and she squeezed his arm, their steps synchronized as they moved away from the building, away from the justice that had just been signed away inside. Penhaligon's hand tightened on the railing, the metal biting into his palm. He wanted to shout. He wanted to run across the road, to grab the man by the lapels of that expensive coat and shake him until the mask slipped, until the monster showed its teeth. But his feet remained rooted to the spot, heavy as lead, anchored by the weight of the signature burning a hole in his inner pocket. The protocol held him, the fear of Croydon. The terrifying realization that the machinery of the state did not care about monsters, only about stability. Clay laughed again. The sound drifted back, carried on a gust of wind that smelled of exhaust and rain. It was a human sound, a neighborly sound. It was the sound of a man who knew he was safe, who understood that the war was over and the victors were too tired to hunt him down. He walked on, his figure dissolving gradually into the yellow fog, becoming just another shadow among many, indistinguishable from the honest men trying to get home to their rationed dinners. Penhaligon watched until the last trace of grey vanished, leaving only the empty street and the swirling mist. The cold seeped through his shoes, numbing his toes, but he did not move. He stood alone on the steps of the Home Office, a witness to a crime that would never be tried, guarding a truth that no one wanted to hear, while the city around him continued its slow, grey drift towards forgetting. The laughter died, not with a fade but a severance, as if someone had cut the wire carrying the sound. The fog swallowed the pair whole, leaving Penhaligon staring at a stretch of empty pavement where the wet stones glistened under the gas lamps, slick and indifferent. He stood there until the cold bit through the soles of his shoes, a sharp, needle-like pain that climbed his ankles and settled in his knees. It was the only thing that felt real. The signature in his pocket felt like a lie. The building behind him felt like a tomb. He turned. The motion was stiff, his joints protesting the sudden shift from stillness to action. The green doors loomed again, but now they looked less like an entrance and more like a mouth, waiting to swallow him back into the digestive tract of the state. He pushed them open. The groan of the hinges was different this time, higher pitched, a shriek of metal on metal that echoed down the tiled hallway. No one looked up. The clerks at their desks continued to scratch their nibs across paper, the rhythmic sound of bureaucracy resuming its steady, mindless beat. A typewriter clattered in the distance, a frantic staccato that sounded nothing like laughter and everything like a machine gun jamming. Penhaligon climbed the stairs, one step, then another. The banister felt greasy under his palm, the accumulated oil of 1,000 hands that had gripped it in moments of hesitation, of doubt, of surrender. He did not look at the doors he passed. He knew what lay behind them, men in grey suits, heads bowed over files that contained the same erasures, the same convenient amnesias, the same signed confessions of moral bankruptcy. The air grew drier as he ascended, the smell of cabbage and wet wool replaced by the scent of dry rot and old dust, the specific odor of paper that had been shuffled too many times. His office was at the end of the corridor. The door was ajar, a sliver of yellow light cutting across the dark floorboards. He pushed it open and stepped inside. Holloway was waiting. The senior administrator sat behind the large mahogany desk, his posture impeccable, his hands folded neatly over a stack of fresh blotting paper. He did not look up as Penhaligon entered, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere just above the detective's left shoulder, as if studying a crack in the plaster that held more interest than the man standing before him. The room was quiet, save for the low hum of the radiator, a rhythmic ticking of expanding metal that filled the silence like a countdown. "You saw him," Holloway said. It was not a question. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection, the tone of a man reading a weather report. Penhaligon did not answer immediately. He walked to the desk, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he were wading through deep water. He reached into his inner pocket, his fingers brushing the folded paper there, the edges sharp against his fingertips. He pulled it out and laid it on the desk. The carbon copy, the file that detailed everything, the meetings, the contacts, the foreign tobacco, the tailored suits, the sheer, unadulterated audacity of a traitor living in plain sight. He smoothed the paper down with a hand that trembled, just slightly, a betrayal of the calm he was trying to project. He was laughing, Penhaligon said. His voice sounded rough, scraped raw by the cold air and the words he had swallowed on the steps. With a woman, on the arm of a woman, while I was inside signing away his freedom. Holloway finally looked at him. His eyes were pale, watery, devoid of any spark of empathy or understanding. He looked at the file, then back at Penhaligon, his expression one of weary patience, the look a teacher gives a slow child who has failed the same test for the third time. "And what did you expect, Arthur?" Holloway asked. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "Did you expect him to wear a placard, to walk about with Traitor stitched onto his lapel? The war is over. The world has moved on. We cannot afford to drag skeletons out of the closet every time a man buys a packet of cigarettes." "He wore the uniform," Penhaligon said. The words came out faster now, tumbling over each other. "He wore the runes. He swore the oath. He stood while men like Gable died in the mud because of men like him." "Private Gable is dead," Holloway said. His voice dropped, losing its patience, gaining an edge of steel. "He has been dead for 4 years. Bringing Clay to trial will not bring him back. It will, however, bring a great deal of unwanted attention to the methods we used to gather the intelligence that put Clay away in the first place. It will expose the networks, the sources, the compromises we made to win a war that nearly broke us. Is that what you want? To destabilize the government for the sake of a single, symbolic prosecution?" "I want the truth," Penhaligon said. He slammed his hand on the desk, the sound sharp and sudden in the quiet room. The inkwell jumped, a tiny splash of black landing on the blotting paper. "I want the truth to be recorded. I want it known." Holloway sighed. It was a long, exhaled breath, the sound of a man who has heard this argument 1,000 times before and finds it tedious. He opened the top drawer of his desk. The movement was smooth, practiced. He reached inside and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was typed, the letters crisp and black, the official letterhead of the Home Office stamped in red at the top. "The truth is what we say it is," Holloway said. He slid the paper across the desk. It stopped just in front of Penhaligon's trembling hands. "This is a report. It states that Douglas Burnville Clay has been monitored for 6 months and found to be of no current threat to national security. It states that his past associations are noted but deemed irrelevant to his current conduct. It states that further surveillance is unnecessary and a waste of public resources." Penhaligon looked at the paper. The words swam before his eyes, blurring into a grey mass of ink. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, a burning sensation that had nothing to do with the radiator. He wanted to tear the paper up. He wanted to throw it in Holloway's face. He wanted to scream until the windows rattled. "And you want me to sign it," he said. His voice was a whisper now, hollowed out by the sheer weight of the impossibility of it all. "I need you to sign it," Holloway corrected. Lifting a heavy fountain pen with a gold nib from the desk, he held it out so the metal gleamed under the electric light, cold and inviting. "It is protocol, Arthur, and you know the rules. Without your signature, the file remains open. If the file remains open, the questions continue. Should those questions persist, people start looking where they shouldn't. Do you understand?" Penhaligon looked at the pen. Then he looked at the window. The smog outside had thickened, pressing against the glass like a living thing, obscuring the city, hiding the streets where Clay was currently walking, laughing, living. The city didn't care. The city wanted to forget. The city wanted to rebuild, to ration, to queue, to survive. It didn't want ghosts. It didn't want truths that complicated the narrative of victory. His hand moved. It felt detached, as if it belonged to someone else, a stranger who was capable of doing things he could not. He took the pen. The metal was cold against his skin, heavy with implication. He uncapped it. The ink inside was black, viscous, ready to permanentize the lie. He looked at the line at the bottom of the page. "Detective Inspector A. Penhaligon." He signed. The scratch of the nib on the paper was loud, a tearing sound that seemed to rip through the quiet of the room. The ink flowed, dark and final. When he lifted the pen, the signature sat there, stark and accusing. A confession, a surrender, a seal on a tomb. Holloway took the paper. He didn't look at it. He simply placed it on top of the stack of blotting paper, aligning the edges with precise, careful movements. Then he opened the drawer again and slipped it inside. The drawer clicked shut. The sound was final. "Good," Holloway said. He stood up, smoothing the front of his jacket. "You may go, Arthur. Go home, have a drink, forget about it." Penhaligon did not move. He stood there, the empty space where the file had been, feeling like a hole in the universe. He looked at Holloway, at the man's calm face, his neat suit, his hands that had just buried the truth without a tremor. He wanted to say something. He wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. They were stuck in his throat, lodged behind the lump of shame that had been growing there for years. He turned. His legs felt weak, unsteady. He walked to the door, each step an effort, as if he were dragging weights attached to his ankles. He reached for the handle. It was cold, brass polished by 1,000 departures. "And Arthur," Holloway called out. Penhaligon stopped. He did not turn back. "Lock the door on your way out." Penhaligon nodded, a single sharp jerk of his head. He pulled the door open and stepped out into the corridor. The light was dimmer now, the shadows lengthening as the afternoon faded into evening. He walked down the hall, past the closed doors, past the empty desks, towards the stairs that led down to the street. He did not look back. He couldn't. He knew that if he did, he would see Holloway standing there, watching him, a small smile on his lips, the smile of a man who knows that the machine works perfectly, that the gears turn exactly as they should, crushing anything that gets in the way. He reached the stairs. He began to descend, one step, then another. The rhythm was mechanical, a puppet's gait dictated by the string of protocol he had just tightened around his own neck. The building seemed to lean in around him, the walls closing in, the air growing thick with the smell of dust and defeat. At the bottom, the green doors waited. He pushed them open. The hinges groaned, a low, protesting complaint that seemed to articulate everything he could not say. Outside, London waited. The smog was thicker now, a yellow-grey soup that clung to the brickwork, tasting of sulfur and unburnt coal, coating the back of his tongue with a film of grit. He stepped out onto the pavement. The cold hit him like a physical blow, seeping through his suit, chilling his bones. He pulled his collar up, trying to shield himself from the damp, but it was useless. The chill was inside him now, deep in his marrow, a coldness that no amount of wool or fire could ever touch. He began to walk, one foot, then the other. The rhythm was mechanical, a puppet's gait dictated by the string of protocol he had just tightened around his own neck. He walked into the fog, into the grey, into the city that had chosen forgetfulness over justice, carrying the weight of a signature that would haunt him until the day he died. The bench wood bit through the thin wool of his trousers, damp and unyielding as a gravestone. Penhaligon shifted, trying to find a patch of dry grain, but the moisture had seeped everywhere, rising from the earth to claim the park just as the smog claimed the skyline. On his lap, the logbook lay shut, its black cover slick with condensation, a sealed coffin for months of tedious observation. He kept his hands flat on top of it, feeling the cold leather against his palms, resisting the urge to open it one last time, to check the entries, to verify that the numbers added up to something other than zero. The order had arrived that morning, typed on crisp white paper that smelled of fresh ink and bureaucratic indifference, instructing him to cease active monitoring immediately. No explanation, no justification. Just a cessation of interest from the very men who had demanded the interest in the first place. A gust of wind stripped the last yellow leaves from the oak tree overhead, sending them spiraling down into the pond. They landed on the surface, brown and sodden, joining the layer of decaying matter that choked the water's edge. It looked like a bruise, that pond, a dark, stagnant wound in the middle of the green space that no one bothered to heal. Penhaligon watched a single leaf sink slowly, disappearing beneath the murk, and felt a corresponding weight settle in his own chest, heavy and final. He was done, the watch was over. The man he had shadowed through rain and sleet, through queues for bread and lines for coal, was now officially nobody's concern but his own. Then he saw him. Across the path, near the iron railings that separated the park from the street, a figure stood hunched against the wind. Clay. The name tasted like ash in Penhaligon's mouth, bitter and dry. The man looked older than he had even 6 months ago, his shoulders rounded, his gait hesitant as he navigated the uneven pavement. He wore a coat that had seen better decades, the fabric worn shiny at the elbows, the collar turned up against the chill. There was no swagger now, no hint of the uniform that had once draped his frame with such terrible, authorized pride. He looked like a clerk, like a widower, like any other ghost haunting the periphery of a city that was too busy rebuilding to notice the monsters walking among the rubble. Clay stopped at a kiosk, the glass panes fogged with breath and condensation. He fumbled in his pocket, producing a handful of coppers that he counted out with trembling fingers. The transaction was mundane, pathetic even. A newspaper, the Evening Standard perhaps, or one of the racing papers if he still harbored hopes of beating the odds. The vendor, a boy no older than 16 with a cap pulled low over his ears, took the money without looking at the customer's face. He handed over the paper, wrapped in brown string, and turned back to his stove, eager for the warmth. Clay tucked the paper under his arm, adjusted his scarf, and began to walk away, merging into the flow of pedestrians heading towards the underground station. Penhaligon watched him go. His hand twitched towards the logbook, an instinct honed by months of noting times, locations, and associations, but he forced it still. What was there to write? Subject: purchased newspaper. Subject: walked west. Subject: breathed air same as everyone else. The words would be a lie if he wrote them with the intent of justice, for there was no justice left in the ink. There was only the record, the dry, dead account of a man who had slipped through the net and landed softly on the other side. Inside his jacket pocket, the paper crinkled. He had carried it for weeks, folded small and hard against his ribs, a secret weight heavier than the revolver he rarely drew. The unsent letter. It contained everything he could not say to Holloway, everything he could not scream into the face of the Home Office, a catalogue of failures and complicit silences that named names and dated crimes. It was his rebellion, his one act of defiance against the machinery that had swallowed him whole. He had drafted it in the dead of night, by the light of a single bulb, his hand shaking with a rage that felt dangerously like hope. Now, sitting on the wet bench with the grey sky pressing down, the hope felt like a foolish thing, a child's fantasy. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closed around the folded sheet, rough and warm from his body heat. He pulled it out, holding it for a moment, reading the top line in his mind's eye without needing to unfold it. To whom it may concern. The irony choked him. There was no one it concerned anymore. The war was over. The trials were done. The world had moved on, building new houses on old bones, pretending that the foundation was clean. Penhaligon gripped the paper with both hands. He tore it. The sound was sharp, a ripping noise that cut through the ambient hum of the traffic. He tore it again and again, reducing the confession to a handful of jagged white shards. The wind caught them immediately, snatching the pieces from his fingers before he could even drop them. They scattered across the wet grass, dancing briefly in the updraft before settling into the mud, among the fallen leaves and the cigarette ends. Some landed in the puddles near the path, the ink bleeding out instantly, the words dissolving into grey slurry, illegible and meaningless. He watched them disappear. A strange lightness filled his chest, hollow and cold but real. He was not a savior, he was not a judge. He was a witness, and his testimony had been filed away in a drawer that would never be opened. The duty was not to fix it. The duty was simply to have seen it, to carry the memory of the man in the SS uniform and the man in the threadbare coat, and to know the difference even if no one else did. Penhaligon stood up. His joints creaked, stiff from the cold and the stillness. He brushed the damp wood chips from his trousers, a futile gesture against the pervasive grime of the city. He picked up the logbook, tucking it under his arm, and turned away from the pond. There was no point in watching Clay any longer. The man was gone, swallowed by the crowd, just another face in the rush hour tide. He walked towards the park gate, his steps slow but steady. The commuters surged around him, a river of grey coats and black umbrellas, all heading home to rationed dinners and cold fires. Penhaligon merged into the flow, letting the current take him. He did not look back at the kiosk, or the pond, or the scattered remnants of his rebellion dissolving in the mud. He kept his eyes forward, on the grey street and the grey sky, carrying the weight of the Ashen Uniform in his soul, a silent burden that would outlast them all. Behind him, a fragment of paper floated in a puddle, the ink running until the words were gone, washed away by the drizzle that never seemed to stop. The Ashen Uniform is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Douglas Burnville Clay, 1950, in the United Kingdom. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.